They went to sleep warm. They never woke up. It is the winter of 1750. We are on the upper Missouri River in what is today North Dakota. Outside, the wind is screaming at 60 miles per hour. The temperature has plunged to 40 degrees below zero. This is the kind of cold that doesn't just freeze water. It freezes breath in your lungs. It creates a whiteout, a blinding vortex of snow where you can lose your direction and die just 10 feet from your front door. But inside the lodge, it is silent. It is calm. It is almost tropical. 10 people are huddled here. A fire burns brightly in the center, crackling with dry cottonwood. The air smells of sage and roasting bison meat. It feels safe. But this safety is an illusion, because in the effort to shut out the cold, they have locked themselves in with something far worse. There is a killer in the room. You cannot see it. You cannot smell it. You cannot taste it. As the snow piles up on the roof, sealing the exits, blocking the airflow, the fire begins to starve for oxygen. It starts to produce a gas that binds to the blood 200 times faster than air. Carbon monoxide. One by one, the family members begin to feel tired. Not sick, just heavy. A headache starts behind the eyes. They think it's just the long day. They lay down on their furs. The fire continues to burn, consuming the last of the air. This was the terrifying reality for the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara peoples. For 5 months of the year, they lived inside the Great White Death. To survive the freeze, they had to build airtight fortresses. But to survive the fortress, they had to master a branch of physics that wouldn't be understood in Europe for another century. Here is the paradox. To stay alive, they had to invite the enemy in. If they sealed the lodge too tight, they died of poison. If they opened it up for ventilation, they died of exposure. How do you keep a fire burning hot enough to heat a space the size of a gymnasium while a blizzard buries you alive without suffocating the 40 people sleeping inside? The answer lies buried under the earth. Literally. Most people think of Native American shelters and picture the teepee, the conical portable tent. And for the nomadic tribes chasing bison in the summer, the teepee was perfect. But you cannot live in a teepee in a North Dakota blizzard. The wind cuts through the skin walls like paper. You need mass. You need insulation. You need an earth lodge. The earth lodge was a marvel of engineering. It wasn't just a mud hut. It was a biological machine. A breathing organism made of timber and sod that regulated temperature, humidity, and airflow with a precision that rivals modern HVAC systems. But the secret wasn't just in the walls. It was in the invisible currents of air that they learned to manipulate. They didn't have fans. They didn't have electricity. They had gravity, heat, and the wind itself. When early European explorers first entered these lodges in the dead of winter, they were baffled. They walked in from a freezing hellscape into a room where people were sitting comfortably in light clothing. They looked for the chimney. They saw only a hole in the roof. They looked for the draft. They felt none. How was the smoke going straight up? Why wasn't the cold air rushing down? The explorers wrote in their journals about the mysterious warmth, but they missed the genius hidden in plain sight. They didn't see the specific angle of the roof. They didn't notice the sunken floor. They didn't understand why the boat on the roof was turned upside down. Tonight, we are going to deconstruct this survival machine. We are going to peel back the layers of earth and timber to reveal a lost technology of aerodynamics. We will see how a civilization mastered the flow of invisible gases to survive the unsurvivable. But first, we have to build it. Because the first step to surviving the poison is digging your own grave. It begins with a circle. Before a single log is cut, the lodge maker, usually the matriarch of the family, draws a perfect circle on the ground. This isn't just a blueprint, it is a sacred boundary. But as soon as the line is drawn, the brutal labor begins. And here is the first secret of the heat retention. They didn't build on the prairie, they built into it. Using hoes made from the shoulder blades of bison, the women of the tribe would strip away the sod and dig down. 1 foot, 2 feet, sometimes 4 feet deep. They removed tons of earth by hand, basket by basket. Why? Why do all that extra work? Because the earth is a battery. In North Dakota, the air temperature might swing from 100 degrees in summer to 40 below in winter, a 140-degree variance. But go 3 feet underground and the temperature stabilizes. The earth stays a constant cool 50 to 55 degrees year-round. By sinking the floor, they weren't just building a house, they were tapping into geothermal energy long before the term existed. In the winter, the ground radiated heat up into the living space. In the summer, the cool earth sucked the heat out. But sinking the floor created a dangerous engineering challenge. The walls of the pit would now have to hold back the pressure of the surrounding soil, and the roof would have to span a gap of 40 to 60 feet without collapsing. To span that distance, you cannot use small branches, you need giants. They went to the river bottoms and harvested massive cottonwood trees. But not just any trees. They needed forked trunks, strong enough to hold up a mountain of dirt. 4 massive posts were erected in the center. These were the central pillars. In their spiritual belief, these posts held up the sky. In engineering terms, they took 80% of the load. If one of these posts shifted just an inch, the entire structure would torque and collapse, crushing everyone inside. To prevent this, they didn't use nails. Iron nails are brittle in extreme cold. They snap. And wood expands and contracts with humidity. A rigid nail would tear the wood apart. Instead, they used a living fastener, rawhide. They wrapped the joints in wet strips of bison hide. As the hide dried, it shrank. It clamped down on the wood with thousands of pounds of pressure, harder than any iron clamp. And because it was organic, it flexed. When the blizzard winds hammered the lodge, the whole structure would groan and shift, moving with the wind, not against it. It was earthquake-proofing in the 18th century. Around the central square, they built a second, larger circle of shorter posts. Then they laid rafters connecting the center to the edge. The result was not a cone, like a teepee. It was a dome, a flattened, polygonal dome. This shape was crucial for what comes next. A teepee has steep sides, smoke goes straight up. But an earth lodge has a shallow roof. This meant the smoke had to travel further to get out. It meant the air moved slower. And this is where the danger creeps back in. They had built a skeleton strong enough to hold the earth. They had a sunken floor to hold the heat. But now they had to cover it. They had to pile tons of willow branches, dry grass, and finally a thick layer of heavy, wet sod over the frame. They were about to seal themselves inside a tomb of mud. Imagine the weight. A 60-foot diameter lodge covered in 6 inches of earth weighs approximately 30 tons. That is the weight of 5 elephants standing on the roof. And once that earth is packed down, the lodge becomes airtight, almost hermetically sealed. This is good for keeping the heat in. But remember the fire? A central fire consumes oxygen at a terrifying rate. In a sealed room, a fire will burn through the breathable air in a matter of hours. As the oxygen levels drop, the fire produces more smoke and more carbon monoxide. The physics says they should suffocate. The math says the smoke should fill the dome from the top down, choking them in their sleep. But it didn't. Because they built a machine on top of the roof that no European had ever seen before. A device so simple, yet so effective, that it acted as a vacuum pump powered by the wind itself. They didn't just poke a hole in the roof, they engineered a valve. If you stood on the roof of a Mandan earth lodge in the middle of a blizzard, you would see something that defies logic. Sitting right on top of the smoke hole exposed to the brutal elements is a boat. It is called a bullboat. It is a round, tub-like vessel made of a willow frame covered in a single massive bison hide. In the summer, these boats were used to ferry trade goods across the Missouri River. They were light, buoyant, and unsinkable. But in the winter, the river is a sheet of ice. The boats should be stored away. Instead, they are hauled up to the roof. Why? Because the bullboat is the most sophisticated chimney cap ever invented by a pre-industrial civilization. Consider the problem. You have a hole in your roof to let smoke out. But outside, the wind is blowing at 50 miles per hour. If you leave the hole open, the wind will act like a lid. It will create a high-pressure zone that pushes the smoke back down into the lodge. The room will fill with smoke in minutes, choking everyone inside. If you cover the hole flat, the smoke has nowhere to go. You die of carbon monoxide poisoning. So, you need a way to shield the hole from the wind while still letting the smoke escape. But it gets more complicated. You don't just want the smoke to drift out, you want to pull it out. This is where the genius of the upside-down boat comes in. They would flip the bullboat over and place it over the hole, but they wouldn't lay it flat. They would prop it up on one side, specifically the side facing away from the wind. This setup harnessed a law of physics known as Bernoulli's principle. When the wind hits the curved dome of the lodge, it accelerates. It rushes up the side of the roof and hits the bullboat. The air is forced to flow over the curved bottom of the boat and around the sides. This fast-moving air creates a zone of low pressure, a vacuum on the leeward side of the boat, exactly where the gap is. Instead of the wind pushing down into the hole, the wind actually sucks the air out of the hole. The harder the wind blows, the stronger the suction becomes. The storm that should be killing them is actually powering their ventilation system. It is a passive exhaust fan running on wind energy. But the wind on the Great Plains is not constant. It shifts, it gusts, it changes direction. A fixed chimney, like the ones built in Europe, cannot adjust to this. If the wind shifts, a brick chimney can backdraft, filling a house with smoke. The bullboat, however, is dynamic. Inside the lodge, the firekeeper, usually an elder with decades of experience, watches the smoke column. They read the fire like a barometer. If the smoke starts to wobble, or if a downdraft hits the fire, they know the wind has shifted. They don't have to rebuild the chimney. They simply send a young warrior up to the roof. He climbs the icy dome, battling the gale. He reaches the boat. He moves the prop log. He rotates the boat so the opening faces away from the new wind direction. In seconds, the system is recalibrated. The suction is restored. The smoke rushes out again. But a chimney is only half of a ventilation system. For air to go out, air must come in. If you have a powerful exhaust pulling smoke out of the roof, you are creating negative pressure inside the lodge. The lodge wants to suck air in from somewhere. If you open the front door, you will get a blast of Arctic air that will freeze the occupants instantly. You need an intake manifold. You need to temper the air before it hits the living space. This is the function of the vestibule. Extending from the main door is a tunnel, sometimes 10 to 15 feet long. It is built just like the lodge, timber frame covered in earth. But it serves a critical thermodynamic purpose. The tunnel has two coverings, an outer skin and an inner skin. When a person enters, they lift the outer skin. They step into the tunnel. The wind howls behind them. They drop the skin. Now they are in the airlock. The air here is cold, but still. They walk down the tunnel and lift the inner skin, usually a heavy buffalo robe suspended from a beam. As they enter the main lodge, cold air flows in with them. But because cold air is heavier than warm air, it doesn't rush into the room at face level. It sinks. The floor of the tunnel is often graded slightly downward or kept at a specific level relative to the lodge floor. The cold, fresh air spills onto the floor of the lodge like water. It flows low, along the ground, towards the central fire. As it travels across the floor, it picks up radiant heat from the earth. By the time it reaches the center, it has warmed up. It hits the fire, heats up rapidly and rises, carrying the smoke up to the bullboat and out of the lodge. This creates a perfect convection cycle. Cold, fresh air comes in low at the perimeter. It is drawn to the center. It warms, rises, and exits the top. The people sleeping along the outer walls are bathed in a constant, slow-moving current of fresh air that is being warmed by the earth beneath them. They are breathing oxygen-rich air before it ever gets to the fire. It seems perfect. A self-regulating machine of earth, wind, and fire. But there is a flaw, a blind spot in the physics. The system relies on heat to move the air. The fire must burn hot to create the draft. But what happens when the wood runs out? Or worse, what happens when the blizzard buries the lodge so deep that the snow covers the tunnel entrance, sealing the intake? When the intake is blocked, the vacuum at the top becomes a killer. The bullboat starts sucking, but there is no air to replace it. The pressure inside the lodge drops, the fire begins to smudge, the combustion becomes incomplete, and the carbon monoxide levels begin to spike, not at the ceiling, but right at the floor, right where the children are sleeping. The most dangerous moment is not the storm itself. It is the silence after the storm. The blizzard usually lasts 3 days. When the wind finally dies, a terrifying silence descends on the plains. Inside the lodge, the family wakes up to a darkness deeper than night. The fire has burned down to embers. The air feels thick, sticky. It tastes metallic. They are alive, but they have been erased from the world. The snow has drifted 10 feet high against the outer walls. It has completely buried the entrance tunnel. The intake manifold is clogged. This is the moment of maximum danger. The physics we admired in the storm, the bullboat suction, the wind-driven exhaust, has stopped working. Without the wind, there is no vacuum at the top. Without the clear tunnel, there is no fresh air coming in at the bottom. The convection cycle stalls. The lodge is now a sealed bottle. And inside this bottle, the silent killer begins to assert itself. When a wood fire burns hot and bright, it produces mostly carbon dioxide. It's not healthy to breathe, but your body tells you it's bad. You gasp, you cough, you move away. But when the fire dies down to coals, which is exactly what happens in the early morning to save wood, the combustion changes. The lack of oxygen turns the chemical reaction incomplete. Instead of CO2, the coals begin to hemorrhage carbon monoxide, CO. Carbon monoxide is the assassin of gases. It is odorless, colorless. It doesn't make you cough. It simply puts you to sleep. In a modern home, a detector screams at you. In 1750, there were no alarms. Or were there? The Mandan and Hidatsa did not live alone. They shared their lodges with their most important technology, their dogs. These were not pets. They were beasts of burden. But in the winter, they were the biological alarm system. The dogs slept on the floor, usually near the perimeter where the coldest air settled. Because they were smaller and had faster metabolisms, they reacted to the poison first. If the morning came and the dogs didn't rouse, if they were stumbling, vomiting, or refusing to eat, the matriarch knew instantly. The air was bad. The spirit of the fire was angry. Immediate action was required. The young men are summoned. They grab buffalo scapular hose and wooden scoops. They enter the dark tunnel. The air in the vestibule is freezing and stagnant. At the end of the tunnel, a wall of white concrete blocks the way. Wind-packed snow is hard as rock. They have to hack their way out. They are digging horizontally, fighting to punch a hole through to the surface. This is grueling work, and as they exert themselves, they consume more of the precious oxygen remaining in the lodge. It is a race against time. Inside, the elders manage the fire. This requires a paradoxical discipline. Their instinct is to throw more wood on, to build the flame back up to create heat and draft. But adding fuel consumes more oxygen. So they do something counterintuitive. They starve the fire. They keep it barely alive, just enough to prevent freezing, but low enough to stop the production of smoke. They sit in the semi-darkness, wrapped in heavy furs, breathing shallowly, waiting for the light. While they wait, they are sitting on top of another secret of their survival. Beneath the floor of the lodge, hidden under trapdoors disguised by dirt and grass, are the cache pits. These are jug-shaped caverns dug another 6 feet down into the earth. Inside, lined with dry grass and willow branches, is the harvest of the summer. Dried corn, squash circles, sunflower seeds, dried bison meat. A single lodge might have 3 or 4 of these pits, holding tons of food. This is why the Mandan and Hidatsa were the wealthiest tribes on the plains. But the cache pit had a dark side. Sometimes, if organic matter rotted in the pit, it produced gas. Or because CO is slightly lighter than air but mixes easily, pockets of poison could get trapped in these deep, unventilated holes. There are oral histories of women climbing down into a cache pit to fetch corn and never climbing back out, overcome by bad air in seconds. Suddenly, a shout from the tunnel. A beam of blinding white light cuts through the darkness. A blast of freezing fresh air rushes in. The seal is broken. The pressure equalizes. The convection cycle restarts. The dogs lift their heads. The fire flares up. They have survived the night. They have survived the burial. But now, a new problem emerges. A problem of logistics. They have cleared the tunnel, but the snow is still piled to the roof. They are effectively living in a deep well. And looking at their woodpile, they realize the storm forced them to burn twice as much fuel as they planned. The cottonwood is gone. The forest is miles away, across a frozen river, buried in snowdrifts that can swallow a horse. How do you heat a 2,000 square foot earthen dome when you have run out of trees? You don't. You have to feed the fire with something else, something you would never expect. When the woodpile dwindles and the blizzard prevents gathering more, the Mandan and Hidatsa didn't freeze. They didn't panic. They simply opened the door and invited the barn inside. This is the surprise that stunned early anthropologists. The Earth Lodge wasn't just a home for humans. It was a stable. During the brutal winter months, the most valuable horses, the buffalo runners and war ponies, were brought into the lodge to live with the family. A corral was built usually on the left side of the entrance, just inside the windbreak. This wasn't just to protect the horses from freezing or being stolen by rival tribes. It was a calculated thermodynamic strategy. A human being at rest generates about 350 BTUs of heat per hour. A 1,000-pound horse generates about 1,500 to 2,000 BTUs. If you bring 4 horses into the lodge, you have just installed a furnace that puts out as much heat as 24 people. Combined with the 10 to 15 family members, the biological mass inside the lodge was generating nearly 15,000 BTUs of heat every hour, around the clock. This body heat battery allowed them to let the central fire die down to a mere flicker at night, saving precious wood while the lodge stayed comfortably above freezing. But a biological engine requires fuel. If you can't get grass because it's buried under 5 feet of snow, what do you feed a 1,000-pound animal? You feed them the forest itself. This is where the cottonwood tree reveals its second purpose. The men would brave the snow to drag back green cottonwood logs, but they wouldn't burn them immediately. Inside the lodge, the women would take sharp knives and shave off the rough grey outer bark. Underneath lies the inner bark, the cambium layer. It is white, moist, and surprisingly sweet. To a horse on the high plains, this is candy. The sound of winter in an earth lodge was not the howling wind. It was the rhythmic scratching of knives, shaving logs, and the contented crunching of horses chewing the bark. Once the bark was eaten, the stripped white logs were set aside to dry. In a few weeks, they would become the firewood. Nothing was wasted. The tree fed the horse heated the human, and the skeleton of the tree heated the lodge. But introducing 4 large animals into a sealed room creates a massive new problem for our ventilation system. It's not just the smell, it's the chemistry. Horses exhale massive amounts of moisture. The humidity inside the lodge would skyrocket. The ammonia levels from the urine, a gas lighter than air, would rise towards the ceiling. The carbon dioxide levels would climb faster. This is where the genius of the sloped roof and the bullboat valve was truly tested. The moisture-laden air would rise. If the roof was just a cold surface, the water would condense and it would start raining inside the lodge. But the sod roof acted as insulation, keeping the interior wood warm enough to prevent massive condensation. And the suction from the bullboat had to be strong enough to pull that heavy, humid air out before it saturated the timbers. The firekeeper had to be even more vigilant. If the air got too heavy, they would have to build the fire up, not for heat, but to increase the draft speed to flush the room. For 5 months this cycle held. The digging, the burning, the shaving of bark, the sleeping with dogs and horses. But nature is cyclical. The deep freeze cannot last forever. As March arrives, the sun gets stronger. The snow begins to melt. The ground begins to thaw. And this brings us to the final, inevitable failure of the Earth Lodge. The very thing that makes it strong, the Earth, eventually betrays it. The roof is made of dirt. Dirt absorbs water. As the snow melts, the roof gets heavier and heavier. The timber beams, weakened by months of humidity and wood-boring beetles, start to groan. And then there is the water. It doesn't just run off, it seeps in. The lodge that was a fortress of warmth becomes a dark, damp cave. The Mandan knew this. They knew their home had an expiration date. But the earth does not forget. And while the lodge could defeat the cold, it faced a different enemy in the summer of 1837. A steamboat named the St. Peter docked at Fort Clark. It carried trade goods, cloth, beads, and a microscopic stowaway, smallpox. Suddenly, the very engineering that made the Earth Lodge a masterpiece of thermal dynamics turned it into a death trap. We talked about the convection cycle, how the cool air comes in low, warms up, rises to the ceiling, and exits through the smoke hole. It was a system designed to scrub the air of carbon monoxide. But for a virus, this airflow was a superhighway. Imagine the scene. It is night. The family is gathered. Cousins, aunts, grandparents, perhaps 20 people in one lodge. One person coughs. In a modern house with open windows, the wind might carry that pathogen away. But the Earth Lodge is designed to keep heat in. The airflow is gentle. It is circular. The virus rides the warm thermal updraft towards the center of the room. It rises toward the smoke hole. But remember the bullboat. It restricts the flow to keep the heat inside. If the draft isn't strong enough to punch through the opening, the air cools near the roof timbers. Cold air sinks. The virus-laden air falls back down, not into the fire, but down the sloped walls, directly onto the faces of the sleeping family members. The lodge became a shared lung. Everyone breathed the same air over and over again. The efficient thermal battery became an efficient incubator. When the fever hit, the Mandan did what they had always done. They turned to their medicine. They built sweat lodges inside the main lodge. Usually, a sweat lodge is a place of purification. But for smallpox, it was a catastrophic mistake. The intense heat of the sweat lodge dilated their blood vessels, spreading the virus faster through the bloodstream. Then, running into the freezing Missouri River caused their bodies to go into shock. The devastation is hard to comprehend. In June 1837, there were roughly 1,600 Mandan people living in the two great villages. By October, only 125 were left alive. 90% of the population vanished in 4 months. The lodges fell silent. There was no one left to shave the cottonwood bark. No one left to adjust the bullboat. No one left to clear the snow from the tunnels. The great wooden circles began to rot. The roofs collapsed. The earth reclaimed the timber. The villages that had stood for centuries turned into mounds of green grass. But the earth does not forget. Fast forward to the 21st century. Archaeologists and modern architects began to look at these grassy mounds with new eyes. They weren't looking for arrowheads or pottery. They were looking for blueprints. Because as we face a climate crisis today, we are realizing something profound. The Mandan weren't just surviving, they were thriving with a carbon footprint of 0. When archaeologists excavated the sites, they found a pattern of post holes that puzzled them. Just inside the entrance, blocking the direct path to the fire, was a barrier. Early observers called it a privacy screen. They were right, but they were thinking too small. This screen wasn't just a wall, it was an aerodynamic spoiler. In modern aviation and Formula One racing, engineers use spoilers and deflectors to manipulate how air moves over a surface. The Mandan builders were doing the exact same thing. If you open the door of a round house without a screen, the cold wind shoots straight for the center. It hits the fire, blows smoke into everyone's faces, and cools the room instantly. But place a screen there, and you force the air to split. The air hits the barrier and is shoved to the left and right. It hits the curved outer walls of the lodge. And here is where the anomaly happens. In physics, there is a phenomenon called the Coanda effect. It states that a fluid jet will be attracted to a nearby surface and remain attached to it even if the surface curves away. The Mandan Lodge was a perfect circle. The air, deflected by the screen, grabbed onto the curved wall and hugged it. Instead of shooting to the center, the cold, fresh air wrapped around the perimeter of the room like a blanket. This Coanda airflow created a moving curtain of air between the people and the cold wall. It kept the air circulating in the sleeping zone fresh and oxygenated. As this air circled the room, it slowly warmed up. By the time it spiraled into the center to feed the fire, it was preheated. This created a central vortex. Because the air was approaching the fire from all sides in a spiral motion, it didn't just push the smoke up, it spun it up. It created a miniature tornado of heat that shot the smoke straight up through the bullboat valve with incredible velocity. To the Western eye, the Earth Lodge was just a clever survival bunker. But to the Mandan and Hidatsa, it was a scale model of the universe. Every single post, every rafter, and every angle held a spiritual significance. And the most critical element was the orientation. You didn't just build a lodge anywhere. The door almost always faced southeast, towards the rising sun and the river. Why southeast? Because in the depths of winter, you want to capture every single photon of solar energy. When the sun rises on a freezing January morning, it is low on the horizon. The long entrance tunnel is aligned perfectly to catch these first rays. The light travels down the tunnel, bypasses the windbreak, and strikes the center of the lodge. It is a solar wake-up call. The sun enters the home before the cold does. But the ventilation hole, the smoke hole, was more than just an exhaust pipe. It was a clock. As the sun moves across the sky, a beam of light enters through the hole and travels across the floor of the lodge. By watching where the spotlight hit, which post, which sleeping platform, the family knew exactly what time it was. They lived inside a sundial. Furthermore, this oculus served as a calendar. The angle of the sun changes with the seasons. The elders knew that when the light hit a specific mark on the rear post, the winter solstice had arrived. The architecture told them when to plant, when to hunt, and when to pray. We live in an age of energy crises. We burn fossil fuels to heat our homes in the winter, and we burn more to cool them in the summer. We try to create hermetically sealed boxes, and yet our homes are often sick. But if the power went out in a Mandan Earth Lodge in 1750, nothing happened. The lodge didn't care. It kept working. This realization has sparked a revolution in sustainable architecture. In the deserts of New Mexico, renegade architects are building earthships, homes built into berms of dirt with south-facing glass walls. They are hailed as visionaries, but if you look at their blueprints, they are essentially building linear Earth lodges. The principles are identical: thermal mass, solar orientation, and the stack effect. We are finally using millions of dollars of research to prove what the Hidatsa knew by intuition. And this technology isn't just about saving money. It is about survival in extreme environments. When NASA engineers design habitats for Mars or the Moon, they aren't looking at skyscrapers. They are looking at Earth lodges. On Mars, the radiation is deadly. You have to dig. You have to cover your habitat in soil. The future of human habitation on other planets looks exactly like the past of the North Dakota plains. A sunken floor, a domed roof covered in dirt, a central airlock. The Mandan didn't just build a house for the prairie. They built the universal geometry of survival. We have deconstructed the physics. We have analyzed the chemistry. We have admired the astronomy. But we have saved the most important secret for last. The Earth Lodge had one final function. It wasn't about heat. It wasn't about air. It was about the mind. Surviving 5 months of confinement in a blizzard requires more than just oxygen. It requires a way to keep from going insane. The Earth Lodge was a psychological machine designed to prevent cabin fever. Look at the shape again. The circle. In our modern square rooms, we have corners. Corners are places to hide, places to isolate. We build walls to create privacy, but often we create loneliness. In an Earth Lodge, there are no corners. When you sit around the fire, you are equidistant from everyone else. The architecture forces you to look at each other. It enforces connection. You cannot be invisible in a circle. The layout was a psychological safety valve. It was a hierarchy, yes, but it was an inclusive hierarchy. Everyone had a designated space in the universe of the lodge. No one felt lost. And when the boredom set in, the lodge transformed. The white clay plastered on the walls wasn't just for insulation. It was a movie screen. At night, the firekeeper would manipulate the flames, casting giant dancing shadows on the curved walls. The storytellers would recite the winter counts, the oral history of the tribe painted on bison hides. The lodge became a theater, a school, a temple. They didn't just sit there waiting to not die. They used the winter to download the software of their culture into the next generation. The ventilation system kept the air clear so the stories could be heard. The thermal mass kept them warm so the dreaming could happen. So, what is the secret of the Earth Lodge? It wasn't just the bullboat valve that sucked the smoke out. It wasn't just the sunken floor that trapped the Earth's heat. It wasn't just the Coanda effect that circulated the air. It wasn't just the horses acting as living radiators. It was the integration of all of them. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara didn't see these as separate problems. They saw the world as a single living system. They understood that the wind is not an enemy to be blocked, but a force to be harnessed. They understood that the Earth is not just dirt, but a battery. They understood that survival is not a solo sport, but a communal act. They built a machine that breathed, a machine that lived. Today, the wind still howls across the North Dakota plains. The temperature still drops to 40 below. The great villages are gone, reduced to silent mounds of grass. But the technology did not vanish. It is waiting. As we look at our own homes, these fragile boxes that consume so much and give back so little, perhaps we should look down. The blueprint for a sustainable future isn't in a sci-fi movie. It's been under our feet for 1,000 years. So, here is the question for you. If you had to survive a 5-month winter without electricity, without gas, and without the grid, could you do it? Or have we forgotten the language of the Earth? If you want to see more forgotten technologies that history tried to bury, click that subscribe button. The fire is out, but the story continues.